The cloisters are also home to many wonderful sculptures, some dating back to Roman times, collected by and added to by the many earls over the last 450 years. The one I've chosen for you is this bust, dated 1865, and showing one of the most famous Victorians in the world. Do you recognise her? That date should be a clue to you. In those days there weren't many famous women, so who might it be? Sculpted in marble, this is a bust of Florence Nightingale by Scottish sculptor John Steell. He was born in Aberdeen in 1804 but grew up in Edinburgh. He was apprenticed to his father as a woodcarver, but on completion of his apprenticeship he became a sculptor and studied for several years in Rome. On his return to Edinburgh he became increasingly well known and was appointed sculptor to Queen Victoria for Scotland. For her, he sculpted what became one of his most important works, a memorial of Prince Albert, her husband, that can be seen in Edinburgh. After completing this, he was knighted. This much smaller but very dignified bust by him shows Florence Nightingale looking down and turning to the left. True to life, it shows her wearing a frilled cap and shawl.
What makes this piece all the more special is just how realistically the sculptor has carved all the ruffles of her cloth cap and the lines and folds of her shawl. It provides us with a perfect example of the dress of her time through the remarkable sculpting skills of John Steell.
Authorities upon her life and times hint that Florence Nightingale preferred not to have her likeness made, but because she knew and liked John Steell, she agreed to sit for him.
She sat for him only twice, happy to do so in the knowledge that the first bust made was being paid for by a collection made through penny subscriptions from non-commissioned officers and men of the British Army. So when you look again at the features of the sculpture, it's all the more remarkable and a credit to the artist that he achieved such a lifelike expression from just 2 short sittings.
Florence Nightingale's life and work is well documented. Still in her teens, she became convinced that God had a purpose for her, but at first she wasn't clear what that was. When she decided that she wanted to train as a nurse, her parents were horrified. In those days, it was considered inappropriate for a woman of Florence's standing to work in hospitals and in male company. But gradually, she overcame her parents' opposition and began visiting and working in hospitals. However, it's for her work in the Crimean War that she's best known, and that was made possible by Sidney Herbert. This brings us back to Wilton House. Sidney Herbert was the only son of George, 11th Earl of Pembroke, and his second wife, Catherine Woronzow. Sidney was an MP and a passionate reformer. In this painting at Wilton, we see him leaning on a red government dispatch box. He held the post of Secretary at War when the Crimean War began. This is the war of 1853-6, in which British soldiers were allied with French and Turkish soldiers to keep the Russians out of the Crimea, a piece of land that juts out into the Black Sea. There were many famous actions during this campaign, not least of which was the charge of the Light Brigade. I hope you'll find out what you can about this, both the battle and the famous poem of that name by Tennyson. Florence Nightingale had become a close family friend of Sidney Herbert and his wife Elizabeth. Upset by what he knew of the conditions in the Crimea, the War Minister wrote to Florence and asked her to lead a group of nurses to care for British soldiers in the military hospitals in Turkey.
I expect you've heard of her as the lady with the lamp, from her custom of tending the wounded and dying soldiers in the gloomy, candle-lit hospital wards.
This charming picture shows a very different image. It's an etching of Florence Nightingale with her tame owl Athena, after a drawing by Florence's sister, Parthenope. It's said that this unusual pet was carried by Florence Nightingale in her pocket. She'd rescued the baby owl from some boys who were tormenting it when she was travelling in Greece. In the picture, both Florence and Athena are looking straight at us. But there's a sad ending to this story. When the time came for Florence to travel to the Crimea, coincidentally this little pet died, and Florence's actual departure was then delayed for Athena's funeral. After the war, Florence Nightingale devoted the rest of her long life to the care and service of the sick and the poor. Not only did she make nursing a respectable profession for young women, establishing a training institute for nurses at St Thomas's and King's College hospitals, but she also advised governments around the world about public health.